So welcome back to lecture 18, and today we're going to talk about videos. So last time, for the majority of the class, we have been talking about this task of 2D image recognition. So for example, we spent a long time diving into a lot of details about different ways to build image classification systems with deep learning. And over the past a couple of weeks ago, we spent 2 lectures talking about moving beyond image classification and really stepping into understanding and recognizing 2D shapes of objects in images. And that led us to tasks like semantic segmentation, object detection, instance segmentation, key point prediction, panoptic segmentation, and all these other sort of 2D shape prediction tasks. And then in the last lecture, we pushed beyond the second dimension and started talking about ways to represent 3D shapes with deep neural networks. So in the last lecture, we talked about taking as input a 2D image and predicting the 3D shape. Or we talked about ways for processing 3D input shapes and then making different classification decisions. And of course, we did that in the context, in order to do that, we needed to define these different types of 3D shape representations. So it turns out that it's pretty complicated to represent shapes in 3D, and we actually needed to define these different sorts of representations to represent 3D shapes, and they all had their own pros and cons. And we saw how we could build neural network models that could deal with all these different types of 3D shape representations. Well, so last lecture was really about pushing convolutional networks from 2-dimensional stuff to 3-dimensional stuff. And we did that by adding this third spatial dimension. And now today, there's actually another way that we can imagine augmenting our neural network models with an additional dimension. So last time we added an extra dimension of space. Today, we're instead going to add an extra dimension of time. So when you think about what is a video is basically a sequence of images that unfold over time. So this is basically another way to deal with 3D this is another sort of 3D type of representation that we can work with deep neural networks. Except that now, unlike having 3 spatial dimensions like we did in the previous lecture, instead now we have 2 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension. And that will lead to a lot of additional challenges. Because as it turns out, we might want to do different sorts of things to represent the spatial dimensions and the temporal dimension in maybe different ways. And we might want to treat them differently depending on the structure of the task we're working about. So then for pretty much everything that we're going to do in videos, our networks are basically moving from these 3-dimensional tensors that we've worked with from 2D data and instead moving to these 4-dimensional tensors. So for example, we can look at a video as a 4-dimensional tensor that has t being the time or temporal dimension, 3 is the channel dimension, which is maybe 3 colors, RGB channels for the raw input video, and then 2 spatial dimensions, h and w. And actually, we'll see that for exactly what type of architecture you use for video stuff, you might sometimes transpose those first 2 dimensions. So sometimes we'll want to put the temporal axis first, and sometimes we'll want to put the channel axis first. And we'll see cases where we want to use either of those 2 different representations. But the basic idea is that a video is just a 4-dimensional tensor. We've got 1 spatial dimension, 1 temporal dimension, 2 spatial dimensions, and 1 channel dimension. And we need to figure out ways to build deep neural networks that can work with this sort of data. So as a kind of motivating task that we'll use to motivate a lot of our architectures on video, we'll imagine this task of video classification. So here, this is basically the analog of the image classification task that we've seen many, many times, except extending it in time. So now the network will accept some input video that will be a stack of RGB frames, and the system will need to select some category label that classifies the action or activity or a semantic category of that input video. And just as in the image classification case, the system will be aware of some fixed set of categories at training time, and will have a training data set that associates a set of videos with some labeled category label. And I think we don't even need to talk about loss functions anymore at this point, because it's clear that we would train the system with a kind of cross-entropy loss function. So that just as we've seen in all the other classification problems in this semester. So then the entire trick that we need to solve is how do we go from this 4-dimensional input tensor to this vector of scores that we can use to train our cross-entropy loss function and train these video classification systems. Well, before we talk about concrete architectures, it's useful to point out exactly what are the types of things that we want to recognize in videos. So when we're doing 2D recognition tasks, we're often recognizing objects. And we all know, and objects are like things that have some kind of spatial extent or identity in the world. So when we recognize 2D images, we might want to recognize like dogs or cats, different types of animals, or maybe inanimate objects like bottles or cars. So that's kind of what we usually try to classify when we're working with two-dimensional input images. And then when we are working with three-dimensional video sequences, the thing that we usually want to classify are actions or activities. So these are things like maybe swimming or running or jumping or eating or standing. And you can see that kind of in the two-dimensional case, we're trying to recognize nouns grammatically. And then in the three-dimensional case, we're often trying to recognize verbs. So the nature of the categories that we're trying to recognize in video is often very different than the types of categories we want to recognize in 2D images. And another thing to point out is that most of the time most of the verbs that we usually care to recognize in videos are actually not just arbitrary actions, but actually actions that human beings are performing. So actually the majority of video classification data sets that you'll find out there, most of them have category labels that correspond to different types of actions or activities that people can do. Because it turns out that that's maybe a thing that we are really interested in. One really important thing that we want to use deep learning for to analyze videos is to recognize what people are doing in videos. So that's just kind of to point out the types of category labels that we usually are trying to predict in video classification data sets. So maybe keep that in mind, keep that distinction in mind about nouns versus verbs as we move through different concrete architectures. So the big problem with videos is that they are really big, right? This is the main constraint that we have that we need to overcome when dealing with video data. So if we try to work at this naively, well, something like a TV show or a movie is often shot at like 30 frames per second for most TV shows, or 24 frames per second for most movies. And now if we just figure out what is the size of raw uncompressed video files, they end up being absolutely massive. So if you imagine that we have maybe a standard definition video stream, then it has a spatial resolution of 640 by 480 in pixels. And if we have that at 30 frames per second, then just storing the uncompressed video stream of a standard definition video stream comes out to about 1.5 gigabytes of data per minute. And this is, because this is raw uncompressed video, where we need to represent each pixel with 3 bytes, one for the red, one for the green, one for the blue. So when you multiply all that out, it actually takes a lot of data to just store raw uncompressed video. If we move to maybe a high definition video, then sort of like full HD video would be at 1920 by 1080, and that's up at 10 gigabytes per minute if we're storing it in this sort of raw uncompressed form. So this is going to be like absolutely catastrophic for dealing with videos in neural networks. If the uncompressed video, just using a byte representation of pixel values, is going to be this big, there's absolutely no way that we can possibly fit such large video sequences into our GPU memory, right? Because you know, a standard state-of-the-art GPU might have something like 12 or 16 or 32 gigabytes of memory. And that memory needs to hold not just the raw video, but also all of the activations of our network as well that we need to process on top of those pixels. So as a result, we can see from just running these numbers that it's completely infeasible to build deep neural networks that actually process the raw temporal and spatial resolution of the types of videos that we usually watch. So the solution is, of course, we need to make the data a lot smaller if we're actually going to process it with deep neural networks. So when we talk about video classification, usually what we mean is that we're training neural networks that classify very short clips of video that are typically something like 3 to 5 seconds in length. And then to make it even more tractable, we'll often temporally subsample those clips so they're at a very low frame rate. So rather than something like 30 frames per second, we might have like 5 frames per second. And then we'll also tend to heavily spatially downsample the spatial resolution of the video frames, of the video clips that we work with as well. So if you recall that when we worked with maybe image classification, it was common to use image resolutions of something like 224 by 224. But now, because of these constraints of working with video, when we work with classifying video clips, we'll often downsample the spatial resolution to something like 112 by 112. So that's actually a very low resolution video. And like if your Netflix stream dropped to a video resolution of 112 by 112, you would probably be very sad as a viewer. But due to computational constraints, that's kind of the video world that our neural networks are going to have to live with, maybe until our memory gets much bigger. So this is just to kind of ground the problem that even though when we think about processing videos with neural networks, we think about kind of maybe processing hours long video, but in practice, that's really not what we do. That just due to these computational constraints, we're really forced to work only on very, very short clips that are very small in size and very small in time. So this is kind of the setup of these video classification problems that we're usually working with. So then maybe to make this a little bit more concrete, in the raw video it would be very, very long and have a very, very high frame rate. But during training, we would take very, very short clips of these very, very long video sequences and then actually subsample them in time as well to reduce the frame rate. And then the models that we would train our models on these very, very short clips. So the idea is that maybe if this input video sequence had the category label of running, then probably each of these little temporal clips that we could sample from the video sequence should also have the exact same label. So when training our video classification models, usually we'll take these very, very short clips from slightly longer videos that we might get in the data set, and then the model will be trained to work on these very, very short clips of lower FPS. And then at test time, often what we'll do is take that model, which has been run on these very short clips, and then apply it at different positions at the full of the original video. And this kind of gives us many different classification decisions for different sub-clips of that raw input video sequence. And then we'll make our final classification prediction for the video by averaging the predictions of the classifier when we run it on these little different sub-clips. So that's a little bit of a kind of trick that we need to play when we're working on this video classification problem. And then we get this kind of mismatch between training and testing. We're doing these short clips, and then testing will often ensemble a set of clips over this longer video sequence. Okay, so then let's actually talk about our very first video classification model. And this seems stupid, but it actually works like really, really well. So the idea is let's forget that we're working on video, and instead let's train a model that is a standard two-dimensional CNN that is trained to classify the individual frames of the video completely independently. So for example, if this video sequence was supposed to have the action of running, then what we'll do is just chop up all the frames of that video sequence into individual 2D RGB images, and then train your favorite standard 2D image recognition model on the individual frames of the video sequence. And they will be trained to classify using the label that we should assign to the entire clip. So, and then at test time, what we'll do is simply run this single frame model on every frame in the longer video sequence, and then average the predictions over all of the video frames. And this seems like a really stupid model, right? Because it's basically ignoring all of this temporal structure in the data. But it turns out that this is actually like a really, really strong baseline for many, many different video classification tasks. So we'll see some concrete numbers later. But basically, my advice is that if you find yourself in the regime of needing to build a practical video classification system, do this first. Because it's very likely that this very simple, straightforward, single frame baseline model actually will work good enough in practice, I think, for many different applications that you might actually want to do in practice. And then all of the kind of fancy temporal modeling that we'll talk about the rest of the lecture will be kind of like, will not usually make the difference between the system working and the system not working. Usually what it does is just kind of bump the accuracy up from pretty good to like maybe a little bit better. So I think you should really not discount this very simple single frame baseline when you're confronted with any kind of video classification or video recognition task. So definitely always try this first. So then we can talk about a slightly more complex model that actually does take into account the temporal structure of the video sequences that we're presented with. And this is this idea of late fusion. So basically, what we did in this single frame baseline is run a CNN independently on every frame of the video and extracted an independent classification decision for every frame in the video. And then at test time, we kind of averaged those using some averaging mechanism. Now, this late fusion approach is basically very similar, except that we're going to make the averaging, we're going to somehow build this notion of averaging across time into the network itself, so that the network can be trained in a way that's aware of the fact that we will be doing this averaging at test time. So more concretely, what we'll often do with this idea of late fusion is that you'll be presented with the sequence of frames from your input video here at the bottom that maybe has a temporal size of t for time, and then your RGB by h and w. And then we'll run your favorite CNN architecture independently on each frame of the video sequence. and that will extract us some frame-level features. So for each, those will all operate completely be operating completely independently, and will be your favorite 2D CNN architecture, like a ResNet or an AlexNet or a MobileNet or whatever suits your fancy. And after running those networks independently on each frame, we will get these frame-level features that will maybe be one channel dimension and 2 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension. So we've just extracted convolutional features for each frame of the video sequence completely independently. And now we need some way to kind of collapse or average or combine all of these per frame independent features. So one way that we can do that is using a fully connected layer that we've seen in early image classification architectures. So then what we could do is take our per frame features, flatten them into one big vector that now has shape t by d by h prime by w prime, and then apply some kind of set of fully connected layers that moves from the flattened features into our final class score C. And then we can train this thing with a cross-entropy loss, as we often do. And this is called a late fusion approach to video classification, because we're kind of fusing the temporal information at a very late phase of the classification pipeline. That we're doing all of this independent per frame modeling with the CNNs, and then at the very end of the architecture, we're kind of fusing information temporally. So this is one of the earliest approaches to late fusion that people worked with, and this was using fully connected layers. But just as we saw in the case of 2-dimensional CNN architectures, using a lot of fully connected layers adds a lot of learnable parameters to your network and can lead to some kind of overfitting. So in fact, another way that we can do late fusion is actually the same trick that we did in image classification models, which is to replace the flattened and fully connected operations with instead some kind of global average pooling followed by fully connected layers. So when we apply this idea of average pooling to the temporal domain, then we will still get these independent per frame features using our favorite 2D CNN architecture. And now we will apply a global average pooling layer that will perform an average pooling over all of the spatial dimensions and over all of the temporal dimensions. So that will collapse out all the spatial information and all of the temporal information and leave us with just a d-dimensional vector that we can then apply a linear layer to get our final class scores. So this is, again, a fairly simple, straightforward approach that is a fairly easy and simple thing to try. And this is, again, an example of late fusion, since we're doing all this independent modeling and then fusing all the temporal information very late in the classification architecture. But so now kind of a problem with this late fusion approach is the fact that it's late, right? So it's actually somewhat difficult using this late fusion approach to model very low-level motions of pixels or features between independent video frames. So as an example, if we look at these clips from this running video here on this slide, maybe one useful signal that the model might want to use when classifying this video as running is the fact that his foot is kind of moving up and down. And maybe in one frame you see the foot is down, and then in the same location at the next frame we see that the foot is up, and this motion kind of repeats periodically at the very low pixel level of the input video sequence. Now, with this late fusion approach, I think it's kind of difficult for the network to learn to model these very low-level interactions between adjacent pixels in the input video frames, because we're kind of summarizing the entire information about each frame in maybe a single vector. So it's sort of difficult for the network to compare these low-level pixel values between adjacent frames. So that, I think, is one intuitive shortcoming of this late fusion approach. So given that this is called late fusion, you should imagine that, you should anticipate that the proposed solution to this would be early fusion. So here the idea is that with late fusion, we were kind of performing independent processing on all of the video frames and then fusing the temporal information at the end of the architecture. Well, we can actually do the opposite, which is instead fuse all of the temporal information of the network at the very beginning of the architecture, in the very first layer of the CNN. And we can actually do this using our familiar friend of 2-dimensional convolutions. So concretely, again, we have our input video frame, our input sequence of video frames at the bottom here, with a temporal dimension, a channel dimension with RGB color values, and then 2 spatial dimensions of h by w. Now we can actually reshape this 4-dimensional tensor and interpret the temporal dimension as a set of channels. So what we can do is then sort of imagine taking our set of input video frames and kind of stacking them along the channel dimension. And that will give us a three-dimensional tensor with a channel dimension of now 3 by t, which is just all of our RGB frames sort of stacked along the channel dimension, and then with our two same spatial dimensions. And this sort of basically we're concatenating all of the frames along the channel dimension, and then we can then fuse all of this temporal information using a single two-dimensional convolution operator. That now where the number of input channels to the convolution is 3t, and the number of output channels is whatever we want in our convolutional architecture. So, and then after this very first layer that is performing this early fusion, then the rest of the network can be whatever kind of standard two-dimensional convolutional architecture we want, because after this very first layer, we've collapsed all of this temporal information, and we just have a sort of three-dimensional tensor to work with. And after that, we can use our favorite 2D architecture. And this hopefully maybe overcomes the problem of, because now hopefully the network can better model very low-level pixel motion between adjacent video frames. Because you could, for example, try to learn convolutional kernels that kind of compare whether adjacent video frames have local pixel motion between them. But the problem with this approach is that we're kind of maybe too aggressive in this approach in the way that we pool or aggregate the temporal information. Because using this early fusion approach, we're kind of destroying or we're kind of destroying all the temporal information after one 2D convolution layer. And it might be the case that one 2D convolution layer is just not enough computation to properly model all the types of temporal interactions that can happen in a video sequence. So for that reason, we might want to consider some kind of other alternative that doesn't really fuse early or doesn't really fuse late. Instead, maybe we want some mechanism that allows us to kind of fuse slowly over the course of processing a video sequence. And for that, we can use a three-dimensional CNN. And this is also sometimes called a slow fusion network. So the idea here is that this is kind of like the CNNs that we used in the previous lecture for processing voxel grids, where now at each layer in the CNN, we're going to maintain four-dimensional tensors that have a channel dimension, a temporal dimension, and two spatial dimensions. And then at each layer of processing inside the CNN, we will use three-dimensional analogs of convolution and three-dimensional analogs of pooling that will allow us to kind of fuse information slowly over the course of many, many layers of processing. So then, as kind of an example of maybe three tiny, so then it's useful to kind of draw distinctions between this late fusion approach, this early fusion approach, and this 3D CNN approach. So to kind of make those distinctions clear, let's walk through three little tiny toy examples of early versus late fusion versus 3D CNN architectures. So these will all be like tiny, tiny architectures that will just give you the flavor of these different types of models. But in practice, we would use much, much deeper, larger models. So for a late fusion approach, it will have, the input will maybe be three channel dimensions, 20 temporal dimensions, and 64 by 64 height and width dimensions. Then the first layer would be a two-dimensional convolution that will maybe be a 3 by 3 convolution that outputs 12 features. And this is kind of, so then it will apply this convolution independently to every video frame. And this will just sort of fuse information across space, but it will not fuse information across time. So then we can write down both the size of the resulting tensor after this operation, as well as the effective receptive field in the original input video after the operation. So you can see that after a single 3 by 3 2D convolution operation, then each output of that 2D convolution is looking at a 3 by 3 region in space, and maybe only a 1 by 1, only a single input frame in time. So then we can kind of look at this by sort of building up receptive fields, just as we did in our familiar 2D convolution case. So then we could imagine maybe we add a 4 by 4 pooling layer after our 3 by 3 com that is again applied independently to every slice in time. That is now going to build up some larger receptive field in space, but not going to build up any receptive field in time. We could follow this with another 3 by 3 convolution that will again build up more receptive field in space, but no more receptive field in time. And then finally have a global average pooling layer where we flatten everything and predict our number of output categories. So then at this global average pooling layer, what we're doing is kind of all at once building up a giant receptive field over the entire temporal extent of the input video, as well as increasing our spatial receptive field over the entire spatial size of the video. So this late fusion approach is kind of building up receptive fields slowly in space, but kind of building it up all at once in time at the very end of the network. So in contrast, if we look at an early fusion approach, then we can see that this is an identical architecture. The only thing that's different is the first convolutional layer. Because now in this idea of early fusion, we've taken our input video frames and stacked them along the channel dimension at the very first layer of the network. So now the first layer of the network is sort of building up a temporal receptive field immediately over the entire temporal extent of the video. But we're still building up this spatial receptive field kind of slowly in space over the course of many, many layers. Now, if we look at a 3D CNN in contrast, then we're replacing all of these two-dimensional convolutions and two-dimensional pooling operations with instead three-dimensional analogs. So now we're going to maintain these four-dimensional feature tensors at every layer of processing inside the network. And you can see that now instead of using a 3x3 convolution that slides the filter over 2D in space, instead we'll use a 3x3x3 convolution that is sliding the filter over both space and time. And now our pooling operation, instead of just collapsing a 4x4 pooling region in space, it's going to average over a 4x4x4 three-dimensional pooling region in both space and time. And you can see that by extending these familiar two-dimensional operators of convolution and pooling into the temporal domain, then it allows us to have this network architecture to build up a receptive field slowly over both space and time over the course of many layers of processing. So for this reason, because it's kind of building up this receptive field slowly over the course of many layers, these three-dimensional CNNs are sometimes called a slow fusion approach, because they are slowly fusing the spatial and the temporal information over many, many layers of processing. And again, in practice, these are like really, really tiny microarchitectures to just give you a sense of what early versus late versus 3D CNNs look like. But in practice, we would use much larger, much deeper models that have many more layers, and probably work on bigger images as well. So then one thing that I always get kind of maybe tripped up on when I first think about video models is like, what exactly is the difference between this 2D convolution operation that we do in early fusion versus this 3D convolution operation that we do in a 3D CNN? Because it seems that in both contexts, we're using a convolution operator to build up some receptive field over both space and time, but exactly the mechanics or the trade-offs or what's exactly different between these two forms of spatial temporal convolution are useful, I think, to look at in a little bit more detail. So in the early fusion approach, recall that what we've done is we've taken our input tensor. So now we're kind of drawing this three-dimensional tensor with two spatial dimensions, h and w, and one temporal dimension, t. And now we're imagining that at every point in this 3D grid, there is a feature vector attached at every point in this 3D grid. And now if we imagine using 2D convolution to process this kind of output, what we're doing is we're having a convolutional filter that extends over a tiny region of space, but extends over the full depth in time. So that means our 2D convolutional filter has the same temporal size as the input video sequence. And now this convolutional weight, we're going to slide over every position in space, because at every position in space, the temporal extends over the full length of time. So we can compute a familiar inner product, and that gives us a two-dimensional output we can pass to further layers of the network. So one kind of shortcoming so this is kind of appealing because it feels like a pretty easy and straightforward way to use convolution to work with temporal data. But one big shortcoming with this early fusion approach using 2D convolution is that it's not temporally shift invariant. So what I mean by that is that suppose that we wanted to learn to recognize sort of global transitions in color. And maybe an important feature that the network might want to learn to recognize is having the entire the color shift from blue to orange at some point in time. Now, one problem with this is that because our filters extend over the entire length in time, then if we want to detect changes in color, both at different positions in time, we actually would need to learn separate filters to represent those changes. So for example, if we wanted to learn a filter, we might be able to learn one filter that can learn a shift from blue to orange at time 3, But if we wanted to recognize a shift from blue to orange at time 7, then we would actually need to use a whole separate filter in order to learn that same temporal change, but at a different position in time. So that means that's sort of a limitation of this idea of using 2D convolution to process 3D data, is that it's kind of just not temporally shift invariant. So in contrast, if we're going to use 3D convolution to process our temporal data, then as input, we're going to accept the same cube with 2 spatial dimensions, 1 temporal dimension, and a feature vector at every point in this cube. But now our convolutional kernel extends over only a very small region in both space and time. So what this means is that now our convolutional filter is going to extend only over a small region in time. So we're going to slide the filter over both all the spatial dimensions as well as over the temporal dimension. And at every position in 3D space over which we slide the filter, then we can compute the inner product between the filter and the chunk of the input at that position, and then compute a single scalar output to produce this full 3D output as output from this layer. And now the key difference is that this idea of 3D convolution fixes this problem of temporal shift invariance that we had with 2D convolution. So now, if we wanted to learn to recognize transitions from blue to orange, we could actually do that at all points in time using only a single 3-dimensional convolutional filter, because we're going to slide that filter over all positions in time. So that allows us to recognize, so now we no longer need to learn separate filters if we want to recognize the exact same thing happening at different moments in time for the input video. So that means that this 3D convolution is maybe somehow more representationally efficient, because we don't need to learn as many filters to represent all the things we might want to learn from video sequences. And also kind of a cool thing about these 3D CNNs is that we can actually visualize these learned filters as video clips themselves, right? So what we can do is that here on the right, we're showing these learned 3D convolutional filters from a 3-dimensional CNN. And because each of these little convolutional filters has a small extent in both space and time, we can actually visualize those filters as little moving RGB video clips. And that gives us some sense for what types of features that these 3D convolutional networks want to learn to recognize. So it's actually kind of interesting to dive into these. Like, you see some of them actually don't seem to learn any motion at all. They're just kind of recognizing the same oriented edges or blobs or opposing colors that we often see in 2D CNNs. But other convolutional filters seem to want to recognize like local motion in different directions. So that gives you some intuition about the types of low-level features that these 3-dimensional convolutional neural networks can learn to represent. So now, in order to kind of benchmark and see the trade-offs of these different approaches, we actually need some data set to train on. So one example data set that people sometimes work with for this video classification problem is this Sports1M data set. So here what they've done is some folks at Google, they went and took 1 million YouTube videos, and for each of those YouTube videos, they annotated it with a different type of sports category. So they took like 1 million different sports videos on YouTube, because a lot of videos of people playing different sports on YouTube, and then annotated them with different types of sports. And actually, like the types of sports in this data set are like really fine-grained. I don't actually know what all of them are. So here are some example input frames from videos from this data set. And now the blue shows the ground truth sport category for each of these video frames. And the next 5 all show the top 5 predictions from a model that was trained to do this video classification task. So for example, this first one, I don't know if you guys can necessarily see that tiny text in the back. This first video, the correct label is track cycling. But the top model prediction was just normal cycling, so that was a wrong prediction. And actually the second prediction from the model was track cycling, which was the correct prediction. But then the next predictions from the model were like road bicycle racing, marathoning, and ultra marathoning. So those are like all different fine-grained, different types of sports that exist in this data set. Or in the second category, it's kind of interesting. Apparently the correct label was ultra marathon, but the next category labels were half marathon, running, and marathon. So I don't know exactly how a model is expected to tell the difference between a full marathon and a half marathon just from a short video clip, but like somehow this model managed to do it on this clip. So that's pretty surprising to me. So that's just to say that I think this is a really challenging data set since it involves all these really fine-grained distinctions of different types of sports categories. And then what we can see is we can now compare a single frame version of the model, an early fusion model, and a late fusion model, and a 3D CNN model. And what's kind of shocking here is just how well this single frame baseline does. So here we see that if we took this just like train your favorite two-dimensional CNN on independent frames of these videos, we can already get up to like over 77% accuracy, which is just like shocking how well this simple single frame baseline model can do. So again, always try single frame baselines first whenever you're confronted with a video classification problem. And then as we move from the single frame to the early fusion to the late fusion to the 3D CNN, we actually see the early fusion works a little bit worse than the single frame baseline, which is a little bit surprising. But the late fusion and the 3D CNN approaches do a little bit better than the single frame approach, but not massively so, which is again just evidence as to how strong this single frame model is as a baseline for video recognition tasks. But of course, if you read this like tiny citation of the slide down in the lower left corner of the slide, you'll see that this paper was actually from 2014, which is quite a long time ago. Like in 2014, people weren't even using GPU clusters at Google to train their models. So these models were actually trained on CPU clusters at Google. And there's a great line in the paper that says that it took all the models a month to train. So I think that the state of the art in sort of convolutional architecture design has advanced quite a lot since 2014. These results are a little bit old and are to be taken with a big grain of salt. So as a result, people have made continual advances in both 2D CNN architectures and 3D CNN architectures since that time. So as an example of an improved 3D CNN architecture is the very famous C3D model for convolutional 3D. And basically this is the VGG of 3D CNNs. So we'll recall that VGG was this like very simple convolutional 2D convolutional network that consisted entirely of 3x3 convolutions and 2x2 poolings. And VGG was just this simple architecture of conv pool, conv pool, conv pool, conv pool. I think you remember now. And now C3D is basically the three-dimensional analog of this VGG architecture. So it consists entirely of 3x3x3 convolutions and 2x2x2 poolings. With the slight exception that the very first pooling only does pooling in space and not time. But basically, it's a pretty straightforward architecture to look at here. And this was a particularly influential video model because unlike the previous Google paper, the C3D authors actually released the pre-trained weights of their model. So as a result, a lot of people who couldn't afford to train these video models on their own data sets would often use the pre-trained C3D model as a fixed video feature extractor for their other types of downstream video classification tasks. So just as we saw that in images, it was very common to pre-train like VGG on ImageNet and then use the features for other tasks. In video, it was also very common to take this C3D model that was pre-trained on a large video data set and then use the features from that pre-trained C3D model for other types of downstream video tasks. But the problem is that this C3D model is like shockingly computationally expensive, right? Because if you imagine just how much computation, like 3D convolution is really expensive because now we need to take a three-dimensional kernel and slide it over an entire three-dimensional spatial-temporal grid. So now everything kind of scales cubically, which is like a really bad way for your models to scale computationally. So then if we go and compute the number of floating point operations that are needed to run the forward pass of this C3D model and kind of sum it up over the entire model, we see that it's like really expensive. So, so even though this model takes a really tiny input of 16 frames in time and a 112 by 112 spatial resolution at each frame, that's even though it takes that very tiny low resolution input, the total computational cost of the model is almost 40 gigaflops for a single forward pass. And for comparison, a VGG16 was like 13.6 gigaflops. So this C3D model is like almost 3 times as expensive as a VGG. And compared to AlexNet, AlexNet on 224 by 224 image inputs was only like 0.7 gigaflops. So then C3D is just like way more computationally expensive than something like AlexNet. So that's kind of a common problem with these video models is that anytime you're using 3D convolution, the models just quickly become very, very computationally expensive. But that said, this C3D model was able to do a pretty good job of pushing up the state of the art on this sports 1M classification task. So here it was it's kind of a similar story that we saw in images, right? That in images, we saw that for a period of time, people built like ever bigger and ever deeper and ever more computationally expensive models on images, and that led to improvements in 2D image recognition. And it's kind of the same story here, that we're just building a bigger, deeper, more expensive video model, and that also leads to higher classification accuracies on this large-scale video benchmark. So that's kind of one angle that you can imagine. So then there's kind of this question of like, what's the best way to build a convolutional neural network architecture that works over both space and time? And maybe one way is just like continue scaling up this C3D model and try to make it bigger and deeper, and maybe add residual connections and batch normalization, all that kind of stuff that we know works well in images. But I think there's another interesting approach, which is to think a little bit more deeply about the fact that space and time really maybe should be treated differently in our models, right? Because when we're using 3D convolution and 3D pooling, we're basically inside the way that the model is performing computation, we're really treating sort of space and time as interchangeable in a way, because the way that we're processing both of them is exactly the same. So instead, what we might want to do is think carefully about ways to represent space and time differently. And one interesting way is to represent motion more explicitly inside our neural network models. And to motivate why representing motion might be a good idea, it's interesting to realize that humans can actually recognize a lot using only motion. So with this with just 3 moving dots, you have some sense of what's going on in this video sequence. So anyone want to guess what's going on there? Or this one's like super clear. Like that's definitely a person walking. That's like definitely a person walking. He's climbing and waving. He's maybe riding a unicycle. So this is kind of amazing, right? It turns out that human brains somehow must be doing something different between processing motion and processing visual appearance, right? Because I think all of us have no trouble recognizing the actions that are going on in this video just from this very low level of motion cues. And it turns out that we don't actually need to see the images or the pixels at all in order to tell what actions these people are performing, or even to recognize that they are people. So kind of motivated by this fact that human beings seem to be able to do a lot with just motion information, there's a class of neural network architectures that try to more explicitly represent motion information as a primitive inside the network. So to kind of make this concrete, we need to talk about how can you even measure motion information more quantitatively using computers. So one way that we often measure motion information is using this idea of optical flow. So optical flow is going to take as input a pair of adjacent video frames and then compute a kind of flow field or distortion field between 2 adjacent video frames. So what it's going to do is say, for every pixel in the first frame, what is the vector displacement telling where that pixel is going to move in the second frame? And there exist many, many algorithms for computing this thing and lots of details about optical flow that we just don't want to go into at this time. But basically the idea is that there exist algorithms for computing optical flow on input image frames. And optical flow is just giving us some kind of local motion cues about how pixels move between adjacent video frames. So then optical flow is kind of highlighting local motion in the scene. And what we're showing in this visualization is visualizing the horizontal component of the optical flow in the top and the vertical component of the optical flow in the bottom. So here, given these 2 input video frames are this like person like drawing a bow and arrow, you can see that the optical flow representation is just highlighting the local motion of the person's arm and of the bow in these adjacent video frames. So now optical flow is now this very low-level signal about motion that we can feed to CNNs to allow them to more explicitly disentangle the appearance of what's going on in videos versus the motion of how the pixels move. So that leads us to this very famous architecture for video recognition called the 2-stream network. So what this 2-stream network does is that it has two parallel convolutional neural network stacks. The top stack is the spatial stream, which processes the appearance of the input video. So because we know that this single frame baseline is such a strong baseline for recognizing videos, the top spatial stream in the two-stream ConvNet is just going to input a single frame from the video clip. And then from that single frame, it's going to try to predict a classification distribution over all the categories that we care about. And now on the lower stream is this temporal stream, which is processing only motion information. So what we're going to do is, given our clip of maybe T video frames, we're going to compute optical flow between every adjacent pair of video frames in the input sequence. So that will give us T, so if we have T video frames, that will give us T minus 1 sets of optical flow between video frames. And then each of those optical flow fields will give us two channel dimensions, one in X and one in Y. So then we'll concatenate all of those things into a single big tensor of size with number of channels equal to 2 times T minus 1, and just stack all of those optical flow fields in the channel dimension, and then use an early fusion approach in the temporal stream to do early fusion to kind of fuse all of those optical flow fields in the first convolutional layer, and then use normal 2D CNN operations at the rest of the network. And then this temporal stream will also sort of try to be trained to independently predict the classification decisions given only the motion information. And then at test time, what we're going to do is that the spatial stream will predict a distribution of our classes, the temporal stream will predict a different distribution of our classes, and then at test time, we'll just take an average of the two probability distributions that are predicted by the spatial and the temporal streams. Yeah, question? Yeah, the question is, where does the 2 come from in the stack of optical flow? Well, that's because each optical flow gives us a displacement vector in the image plane. So optical flow at every point in the image, it gives us a two-dimensional vector telling us both, so that's the x component and the y component of that optical flow vector at every point in the input image. So that gives us the 2. And then this two-stream network, if we look, so this, I've kind of like done a bit of a bait and switch on you, and this is actually a different data set than we've looked at in the previous slides. But if we look at this two-stream network, we see that this two-stream network using only the temporal stream is actually able to outperform this spatial stream, which means that this idea of recognizing activities from motions is maybe not particular to our own human brains. It turns out that our neural networks are also pretty good at recognizing activities using only motion information. And then when we fuse the appearance stream and the temporal stream, then we actually get a slight improvement over using only the temporal stream alone. Okay. So basically, at this point, now we've seen a bunch of different ways for modeling short-term structure using different types of CNN architectures. So we've seen using maybe 2D convolution or 3D convolution or optical flow as ways to compute information over the temporal dimension of our input videos. But all of these different types of processing operations we've seen so far are very, very local in what they are able to do. Right? So 3D convolution is maybe looking at early fusion actually just like didn't really work that well. 3D convolution only is looking at only a very tiny receptive field in time, and optical flow is also only looking between adjacent frames to compute the motion between a pair of frames. But what happens if we actually want to build CNNs that can recognize stuff which is like more distant in time? Well, then we're going to need some other kind of operator. But it turns out we've already seen one thing in this class that lets us, one type of neural network architecture that lets us deal with very long-term sequence information, and that's recurrent neural networks. So why don't we combine together these two ideas? So here the idea is that we'll have our video stream in time at the bottom. We'll apply some kind of CNN, either a 2D CNN or a 3D CNN, to extract local features at every point in time. And then we'll use some kind of recurrent neural network architecture to fuse information temporally given the outputs of these independent RNNs. And then we could use kind of a many-to-one operation. If we wanted to make a single classification decision at the end of the video, we could use the final RNN hidden state to then make the prediction over the entire video sequence. Or we could also do kind of a many-to-many task and maybe make a set of predictions at every point in time over the video. And it actually turns out there was a paper all the way back in 2011 that proposed this exact architecture that used sort of 3D CNNs to extract spatial-temporal information locally and then fuse them over long-term using an LSTM. So this was like way back in 2011. I think this paper was way ahead of its time, and people should cite it more. But the one that people tend to associate this idea with more is this 2015 paper that I think got a little bit more recognition. And then another kind of a thing to point out here is that one trick when combining CNNs and RNNs for processing videos is that sometimes we only backpropagate through the RNN. Remember, like in C3D, we talked about people would sometimes use C3D as a fixed feature extractor. Well, then here we could do that same thing in this CNN RNN setup. So we could use a pre-trained C3D that's been trained on a video data set, and then use C3D as a feature extractor to extract features from every point in video, and then use an RNN to work on top of those pre-extracted C3D features. So that will be a way to get us around this kind of memory constraint. And if we're only using the CNN as a feature extractor, then we don't need to backpropagate into the CNN, and then we can actually train these models over very wide time periods as well. So that's kind of an appealing approach. Okay, so now we've kind of seen maybe two different approaches for merging temporal information. One is using kind of operations inside the CNN that kind of merge information locally, and the other is using some kind of recurrent information to kind of fuse at the top, outside, after we run our CNN architecture. So then is there some way that we can combine both approaches? And it turns out we can maybe take another inspiration from recurrent neural networks and look back at this idea of a multi-layer RNN. So now what we can do is, remember in a multi-layer RNN, we had this two-dimensional grid, where at every point in the grid, our vector was going to depend both on the previous vector in the previous layer at the same time step, as well as the vector from the previous time step at the same layer. And then we would process sequences of arbitrary length by sharing weights over the sequence. Well, we can actually do the exact same thing using our convolutional neural networks. And now we can build a kind of multi-layer recurrent convolutional network. So now what we're doing is we're building up this two-dimensional grid of features. Every point in this two-dimensional grid is a three-dimensional tensor with two spatial dimensions and one channel dimension. And now at every point in the grid, this feature tensor is going to be computed by combining both the features at the previous layer at the same time step, as well as the features at the previous time step of the same layer. And then we can fuse these two things using some kind of convolution operation. So then to see exactly the way that we might fuse these things, remember that in a normal 2D CNN, what we're doing is we're kind of inputting one 3D tensor, running 2D convolution, and then outputting another 3D tensor. Now what we want to do is build a recurrent convolutional network where we're taking as input two 3D tensors. One gives us features from the same layer and the previous time step, and the other gives us features from the previous layer and the same time step. And then we want to fuse these using some kind of RNN-like recurrence formula that gives us the features for the current layer and the current time step. And this, if you'll recall, this kind of structure looks very similar to the structure that we saw when using recurrent neural networks. So now to use the exact functional form here, what we can do is just, again, copy and paste from our favorite recurrent neural networks. So if you recall what we did in a vanilla tanh RNN, we would take our two inputs, project each of them using a separate learned weight matrix, add the two results, and then squash with the tanh. And this operation would give us our next output vector. Well, now in order to convert this vector version of an RNN that we've seen before, what we can do is replace all the matrix multiply operations with 2D convolution operations instead. So now, in order to take kind of a recurrent convolutional form of this vanilla RNN, we can use this architecture here. So then what we can do is, given our two feature tensors, one from the same layer in the previous time step, and one from the same time step in the previous layer, we can project each of them to some new feature tensor using some 2D convolution operation, then sum them, and then squash the result with a tanh. And that will give us our next feature vector at the next, our output feature vector for the recurrent RNN. And then we could do this with kind of any RNN architecture. So then you could take your favorite RNN architecture, like a GRU or an LSTM or something else, and just translate it from this kind of RNN that operates on vectors into an RNN that operates using convolution over three-dimensional feature maps. And the way that you do that is just simply convert all of the matrix multiply operations into convolution operations instead. So then what we've done here is that we're kind of we saw this previous approach on the left, actually combines two different ways of modeling spatial and modeling temporal information. So if we use a CNN and then an LSTM on top, then inside the CNN, we're kind of modeling local structure between adjacent frames. And then the RNN is maybe processing long-term global structure. Well, now using this recurrent CNN, then it's kind of like every layer, every neuron inside of our convolutional network is itself a little recurrent network. So there's kind of like both spatial and temporal fusing happening in this very nice way inside every layer of the network. So this is actually a very beautiful idea, I think, but it turns out that people have actually not used this idea too much in practice. So then to think about why that might be the case, it turns out that even though this idea is very beautiful, it's actually not very computationally effective, right? Because the problem is that RNNs are actually very slow for long sequences, because RNNs force you to compute the previous time step before you can compute the next time step. So that means that RNNs just don't parallelize very well over very, very long sequences. And I think that's a reason why people have actually not used this kind of recurrent CNN architecture so much in practice. And if you think about ways to solve this problem, you should actually, again, think back to our discussions in previous lectures, where we talked about different ways to model sequences and their pros and cons. So in a previous lecture, we talked about these different approaches for processing long sequences. We saw one approach was recurrent neural networks, which are nice because they're good at modeling long-term temporal information, but they were bad because of their sequential processing. And now that's kind of, in the video domain, that's kind of equivalent to this architecture of CNN followed by an LSTM. Now we had this other approach, which is maybe 1D convolution for processing sequences. And this was nice because it's sort of computationally effective. We can parallelize the computation of the sequence at training time. We no longer have this sequential dependence on the time steps. And now in video, the equivalent of this is kind of 3D convolution. But if you'll recall, we actually saw another mechanism for processing sequences in the past. And that's this notion of self-attention. So if you'll recall, self-attention kind of like was really good at processing long sequences because it computes this like attention between all pairs of vectors. And it's highly parallelizable because there's no temporal dependency on the structure, just like with RNNs. So now, then the question is, can we find some way to apply this idea of self-attention to our video, to process video sequences as well? And of course, it turns out the answer is yes. So a quick reminder on self-attention. Remember that the input was a set of vectors. Then for every input vector in the set, then we would predict keys, queries, and values. Then we would, by using some kind of linear projection operator on the input vectors, we would compute an affinity matrix, which tells us how much is every pair of vectors related by computing some kind of square root scaled dot product between the keys and the queries. And then the output for each vector would be this weighted linear combination of the values that are weighted by the values in the affinity matrix. So now we can actually just port this whole architecture over into 3D, where now what we're going to do is process some part of our network using a 3D CNN, and that will give us this 4-dimensional tensor with a channel dimension and 3 spatial dimensions. And now we can interpret this 4-dimensional tensor as a set of vectors, where we have a set of vectors of dimension c, and the number of vectors is t times h times w. And then we can just run this exact same self-attention operator using the set of vectors from some layer in a 3D convolutional network. So then we actually have seen this exact slide before in a previous lecture. It had 2D convolution instead of 3D convolution. But the idea is that we'll receive some set of input features from a 3D CNN. We'll compute keys, queries, and values using 1 by 1 by 1 convolution. Then we'll compute some inner product between every key and every value, and then we'll compute a softmax over one of the dimensions. And that will give us this big affinity matrix, or a set of attention weights. Then we'll use this to combine, to linearly weight the values, and then sum that out with a matrix multiply. And then it's very common to actually project the output of this operation with another 1 by 1 conv, and then actually to connect the whole thing with a residual connection. So that gives us, so when we combine all these things together, then this operator is a block that we can slot into our 3D CNNs that's computing a kind of spatial-temporal self-attention. And this is sometimes called a non-local block for the paper that introduced it. And now kind of a neat trick is that we can actually initialize this, if we initialize this last conv layer to be all zeros, then everything inside this operator is going to compute zeros, which means that the whole block is going to compute the identity because of the residual connection. So then actually a common trick that people use with these non-local blocks is to initialize the non-local block such that it computes the identity function by initializing the last thing to zeros. And then we can take a non-local block that is computing identity and insert it into an existing pre-trained 3D CNN model, and then continue fine-tuning with this additional inserted non-local block. So that's kind of a trick that people will use. So then it looks something like this, that now we have this notion of, we have some kind of 3D CNN, and we're going to slot in these non-local blocks at different points in the 3D CNN. And now the 3D CNN chunks are kind of going to do this slow fusion over space and time. And now each non-local block is going to give us this global fusion over all of space and all of time. So this is actually a pretty powerful, pretty close to state-of-the-art architecture for video recognition. But then the problem is, what is the actual, so then now non-local blocks give us this powerful way to introduce global temporal processing into our 3D ComNets. But the question is, we still need to choose some 3D CNN architecture that we can insert our non-local blocks into. So then the question is, what is actually the best 3D CNN architecture for us to build? So one really cool idea is this idea of inflating existing two-dimensional networks from 2D into 3D, right? Because we know that there's been a lot of work on people doing a lot of effort to design really good two-dimensional CNN architectures. And somehow we would not want to repeat all of that effort as a community. And we don't want to sort of start over from scratch in inventing the best 3D CNN architectures. So instead, what if there was a way where we could take a 2D CNN architecture that we know works well on images, and then somehow adapt it in a very tiny way to make it also work on video? So that's the idea of inflating a two-dimensional convolutional network and sort of blowing it up like a balloon, and then adding this third dimension to an existing network architecture. So then the recipe is that we're going to take an existing two-dimensional CNN architecture that has maybe two-dimensional convolutions and two-dimensional pooling operations. And then for every one of those operations, we're going to replace the 2D convolution with a 3D convolution, and replace each 2D pooling with a 3D pooling. And now the only choices that we need to make, so then what that kind of looks like is that here's an example using the inception block. So then the paper that introduced this was from Google, and inception architecture was from Google, so of course they had to apply that thing on top of the homegrown network architecture. So then here's an example of the 2D inception module. Remember that it has these parallel branches of convolution and pooling, and then it kind of concatenates them after having these parallel branches of processing. And now after inflating to 3 dimensions, all we do is add an additional temporal dimension to each convolution operation and to each pooling operation. And this gives us this super simple recipe for taking a 2D architecture and just applying it to 3D. But it turns out that this is about transferring architectures, right? So far, this trick has allowed us to take an architecture that works on 2D networks and then formulaically change the architecture so that it can be applied on 3D videos as well. But it turns out we can actually go a step further, and we can not only inflate the architecture, we can also transfer the weights, the trained weights, from a network which was trained on images, and then we can use those weights that were trained to operate on images to actually initialize the inflated version of our 3D CNN. And to see how that works, what we do is, remember that when we inflate the CNN, we were going to add this extra temporal dimension to all of the convolution layers. So now what we can do is in order to initialize the weights of this inflated architecture using weights of the image version, what we're going to do is copy the convolutional kernels for each convolution layer and copy it t times in time. So we're not only adding this extra temporal dimension, we're actually just copying in time the weights of each convolutional layer and just like duplicating them in time. And then after you duplicate them in time, you then divide them by the duplication factor. And the reason that we do this is that because if you imagine taking an original input image and then making the world's most boring video by copying that input image many, many times in time, that will give us this sort of trivial, constant input video. And now, if you imagine running this 3D convolution with duplicated weights on the boring input video, that will end up computing the exact same result as running the 2D convolution on the original image. So what that means, so that you can kind of like think through this, all what's going on, but basically this works because convolution is a linear operator, right? So when we duplicated the frames in time, then we can also duplicate the weight in time and divide by the duplication factor, and that means we're computing the exact same thing. So because of this trick, this super cool trick actually allows us to pre-train a model on images and then inflate the architecture and inflate the weights, and then continue fine-tuning that model on a video data set. And moreover, it also lets us recycle all of the existing architectures that we know work well on images, and also recycle all the pre-trained models that we have laying around that work well on images. So then this actually works quite well. So then if we kind of look at yet another video data set called Kinetics 400, then if we run this per frame baseline, then the blue bars here are showing training from scratch on the video data set, and the orange bars are showing models where we initialize the video model from the image model. So we can see that for a per frame model, moving from a per frame model to this CNN LSTM model to this two-stream CNN actually gives us steady improvements. But as we move from the two-stream CNN to an inflated CNN, that actually does much better. So then this kind of gives us some empirical results that actually this idea of taking 2D ComNets and inflating them in time is actually a pretty good way to generate good 3D CNN architectures. And it turns out that two-stream networks is still a good idea. So we can actually take two inflated networks and take one inflated network to work on the appearance stream and a second inflated network to work on these optical flow fields. And that gives us a two-stream inflated network that actually works quite well. Okay, so then kind of as a fun aside, one thing we can do is that now that we've got these kind of two-stream networks that work really well at classifying videos, we might want to know, like, how can we visualize what these video models have learned? And we can actually use this exact same trick that we've used for visualizing trained models in images. We can take an input, we can randomly initialize an input image, randomly initialize a flow field, and then compute forward passes through the trained network to compute the score, the classification score, and then backpropagate through the network to compute the gradient of the score with respect to the input image and respect to the flow field, and then we can use gradient descent or gradient ascent to find the image and the flow field that maximize the classification score for the particular category. So then, what does this look like? So then here's an example. So then here on the left, we're showing the optimized image for the appearance stream. And then in the middle, we're showing an optimized flow field that has been, we added some temporal constraints to constrain the flow field from changing too fast in time. And then on the right, we've kind of lifted that temporal constraint and allowed the flow field to change faster in time. So can anyone guess the action that's going on in this video frame? I think I heard weightlifting. That was a good guess. Right, so this is actually pretty cool. Then we see that the appearance stream is kind of looking for barbells anywhere in the image. At the slow motion stream, it kind of looks like it's looking for kind of like the bar wiggling at the top of the lift. And in the fast motion stream, it looks like he's looking for the part where it pushes the bar overhead. So that's actually pretty exciting. Okay, let's try it again. So here's the appearance stream, here's the slow motion, and here's the fast motion. I don't think anyone's going to guess this. What? Eyes? Eyes or face? That's a good guess. It's actually applying eye makeup. Right? So you can see that for the appearance stream, so there's like a lot of YouTube videos of like people doing makeup tutorials, right? And then, so that on the appearance stream, it's kind of looking for eyes anywhere in the input image. And now for the slow motion, it kind of looks like maybe the motion of the head or the hands. And then the fast motion kind of looks like the local brushing motion of actually applying the makeup. So I thought it was really cool that we can take all these same techniques that we know and love for visualizing images, and then just kind of apply them on video sequences as well. Okay, so then I also wanted to briefly mention, so kind of looking at these two-stream networks, we saw that they still rely on this external optical flow algorithm. And it would be really nice if we could relax that constraint and just build networks that can train on the raw pixel values and not rely on this external optical flow. So that brings us to this state-of-the-art SlowFast network that was just published like a month ago that is actually current state-of-the-art on a lot of video recognition tasks. So what the idea is that we're still going to have two parallel network branches, just as we did in the two-stream network, except that both of them are going to operate on raw pixels. The difference is that they are going to operate at different temporal resolutions. So one branch will be the slow branch that operates at a very low frame rate, but is a very expensive network that uses a lot of channels at every layer of processing. So to visualize this network, we kind of have three dimensions we can play with. One is the spatial dimension of the input image. One is the channel dimension, the number of features or number of layers at every layer of the network. And the other is the temporal dimension, which is what is the temporal frame rate at which the network is applied. So then the first branch is this slow branch that uses uses a very slow temporal frame rate, but a lot of channels. So it's using fewer frames, but putting a lot of processing on each frame. Then, so it's a low frame rate. And then the second branch, of course, is the fast branch that operates at a higher frame rate, but uses a much thinner network. So then the fast branch operates at a high temporal frame rate, but uses only a little bit of processing on each frame. And then, so it uses a high frame rate, and it uses a very small number of channels at every layer. And moreover, there's lateral connections that fuse information from the fast branch back into the slow branch. So unlike the traditional two-stream networks that only fuse the information at the very end through averaging, these SlowFast networks are actually fusing information at multiple stages inside the network. And then at the very end, there's some kind of fully connected layer that does the predictions. And then I'm not going to walk through this in detail, but this sort of gives us the concrete architecture instantiation of these SlowFast networks. And this kind of combines together all of the techniques that we've talked about in this lecture. So it has two streams, one that's operating on mostly appearance, and one that's operating on temporal information. Each of these streams is itself an inflated ResNet 50 architecture. So this brings us back to this idea of inflation. So they take an existing ResNet 50 architecture that we know works well on images, and then inflate it in time to form each of these two streams. But now the difference is that the slow pathway operates at a very low frame rate, and the fast pathway operates at a very high frame rate. And then it turns out that we can also add non-local blocks into this model as well and get it to work really well. So I don't want to go through this in detail, but I think this is actually the current state of the art in video understanding and video recognition for a lot of tasks. So if you're looking for the model to use today, I think it's this one. Okay, then I also wanted to very briefly mention that so far we've talked mostly about this task of classifying very short video clips, like taking these 3 to 5 seconds of video and then predicting a classification score. But this was a good task to motivate a lot of our spatial-temporal architectures in ComNets. But it turns out that, of course, there's a lot of different video tasks, video understanding tasks, that people try to tackle with convolutional neural networks. So as just a very brief sample, another thing that people sometimes want to do in video is work on this task of temporal action localization. So here, we're going to be given a very long, untrimmed video sequence. And now we're going to want to detect there might be multiple activities that happen in this video sequence. And we want the model to both detect all the activities and tell us for each activity which span in time did that activity occur for. And you can imagine that you could actually build an architecture similar to faster RCNN that did this type of operation. And this is indeed what people have done. So you can imagine this type of architecture that does now kind of like some lightweight computation over the video sequence to get action proposals instead of region proposals that tells us what regions in video are likely to contain an action, and then have a second stage as some kind of like 3D ComNet that that processes the raw pixels or the features of each of those actions. So you can imagine building a kind of faster RCNN-like architecture that works over space, that works over time. And of course, now we've seen how we can build models to detect objects in space. This model lets us detect actions in time. So of course, we've got to do both. So there's also some work on spatial-temporal action detection. So here the task is that the input is this is like a long video sequence. And the task is that you need to detect the people, all the people in each video frame, and also say the temporal span of the actions that those people are performing in the video. So now this is a super challenging task because it involves both spatial detection in each frame as well as temporal detection in time. And one really exciting data set for this spatial-temporal detection task is this very recent AVA data set that was published just last year in 2018. So what they did is they went and annotated a bunch of movies with different kinds of actions that people are doing. And now, so this also brings in the problem of very long temporal dependencies, very long video clips. So now you need to detect, not just like classify little 2 or 3 second clips, but instead the input is like 15 minutes of video. And you need to both detect all the people in that 15 minutes of video and say what activities they're performing. So I think there's been not yet a ton of work on this data set, but I think that in the next couple of years, I predict that we'll see a lot of people moving to this kind of spatial-temporal activity detection on a long untrimmed video, because I think that's an exciting task that people will probably start working on. So that was kind of our whirlwind tour of video models today. So today we saw many, many different video classification models, including building all the way up to SlowFast networks, which again was like just published this like a month ago, and I think is the current state of the art. So if you're looking to work with video, I think that's a good one to play with, and actually there's code available as well. So that's our brief summary of video models. And then next time, we'll move to a completely different topic and start talking about generative models, and in particular about generative adversarial networks.